Kepler-279c looked like every other depleted mining moon Nathaniel Cross had surveyed in the past 3 years. Airless, pockmarked with extraction scars, and thoroughly abandoned by anyone with better options. The settlement ruins sprawled across the northern hemisphere in the organized chaos typical of corporate mining operations. Habdomes clustered around processing facilities, transit tunnels connecting work sites to living quarters, and the skeletal remains of equipment too damaged or worthless to salvage. Nate's ship, the Meridian's Edge, settled onto a landing pad that had once serviced cargo haulers, but now served only as a flat spot marginally less cratered than the surrounding terrain. His atmospheric sensors confirmed what the pre-survey data had promised. Thin atmosphere, no biological signatures, surface temperature currently hovering at -40°C and dropping as the moon rotated away from its gas giant primary. Home sweet condemned moon, Nate muttered, running through post-landing diagnostics with the mechanical efficiency of someone who'd done this 46 times before. The ship's systems reported normal function, which meant everything was held together by repairs and stubbornness, but nothing was actively failing. Good enough. He sealed his environmental suit, checked respirator seals twice out of habit ingrained by 3 near-death experiences involving equipment failure, and cycled through the airlock. Kepler-279c's gravity, 0.38 standard, made his first steps feel like swimming through air. After 3 years of survey work, Nate had developed the shuffling gait that kept you grounded in low-G without wasting energy fighting momentum. The ruins spread before him in the kind of desolation that reminded Nate why he'd chosen this work. No people, no expectations, no disappointments, just structures, data, and reports that no one read carefully. Perfect. He deployed sensor drones from the Edge's cargo bay, watching them scatter across the settlement like metallic insects seeking carrion. They'd map the site, catalog salvageable equipment, and confirm the absence of biological activity. Meanwhile, Nate would conduct manual inspection of key facilities, power systems, structural integrity, anything that might complicate the sterilization process. The Verath Consortium had abandoned this site 15 years ago when they went bankrupt, leaving behind a settlement that once housed 3,000 workers from a dozen species. Standard evacuation protocols should have removed all personnel, but Nate had learned to expect surprises. Sometimes people got left behind deliberately, choosing to stay in familiar ruins rather than face uncertain refugee status. Sometimes they got left behind accidentally, victims of bureaucratic oversight or simple bad luck. Either way, Nate's job was to confirm the moon was empty before signing off on sterilization protocols that would scour the surface clean in 72 hours. The first day passed in routine inspection. Habdomes showed the expected signs of hasty evacuation, personal belongings scattered like archaeological artifacts, meals half-eaten and freeze-dried in the low humidity, children's toys that made Nate's chest tighten with thoughts about the families who'd called this desolate rock home. He cataloged it all with detached professionalism, filing reports that documented abandonment without dwelling on the human or alien cost. Day 2 brought him to the industrial facilities, processing plants where rare earth elements had been extracted and refined, now silent except for the occasional groan of metal contracting in temperature shifts. Equipment rusted into abstract sculptures, valuable components already salvaged by earlier scavenger operations. Nothing here worth preserving, everything here ready for the thermal purge. His drones reported consistent findings. No power signatures, no biological activity, no complications. Textbook abandoned site. Day 3 broke the pattern. Nate was inspecting the settlement's educational facility, a building that seemed oversized for a mining operation, until he remembered that long-term installations needed schools, childcare, community spaces. The Verath Consortium had actually tried to build sustainable settlements, not just extract and abandon operations. hadn't saved them from bankruptcy, but at least they'd tried. The building's upper levels matched expectations. Classrooms with furniture sized for multiple species, educational materials in a dozen languages, holographic projectors still containing lesson plans about stellar formation and basic mathematics. Sad and ordinary. Then his handheld scanner picked up something that wasn't ordinary, a power signature, faint but active, coming from below ground. Nate frowned, checking his site maps. The educational facility wasn't supposed to have basement levels. Lunar construction typically handled radiation shielding through surface materials, not depth. But the signature was definitely there, approximately 15 meters below the surface, running on what looked like geothermal power. He found the access point behind a collapsed storage wall, stairs descending into darkness, older construction than the prefabricated structures above. Someone had discovered natural lava tubes and converted them into permanent facilities, building down instead of up. Nate's training screamed warnings about unknown hazards, about protocols requiring remote investigation before direct contact. But he'd also been doing this job long enough to recognize when curiosity outweighed caution. He activated his suit's lighting array and descended. The architecture changed as he went deeper. The prefab uniformity of corporate construction gave way to hand-carved spaces that followed the lava tube's natural contours. Someone had spent real time here, building something meant to last rather than something meant to maximize quarterly profits. The power signature led him through corridors lined with what looked like cultural artifacts, art pieces, data storage units, holographic displays showing star charts and historical records. A preservation archive, Nate realized. Someone had built a library down here, hidden beneath the mining settlement's official footprint. He reached a sealed door, its manual override controls still functional. The seal was intact. This room had maintained its own atmosphere independent of the surface structures, drawing power from geothermal sources that would outlast the settlement by centuries. Every protocol Nate had ever learned said he should stop here, report the finding, request guidance from first contact specialists. But he'd also learned that following those protocols often meant discoveries like this got buried in bureaucratic processing for years, if they were preserved at all. He checked his suit's seals one more time, confirmed his environmental protections, and manually overrode the door. It opened into a chamber that made Nate forget how to breathe. The space was a perfect fusion of archive, laboratory, and sanctuary. Walls lined with data storage systems that hummed with quiet power. Holographic displays flickering with information that looked like cultural records, scientific databases, artistic collections. And in the center of the room, 4 stasis pods arranged in a circle, their status indicators showing active suspension but minimal metabolic function. 4 people, sleeping in technological coffins, waiting for rescue that was 3 days away from being rendered permanently unnecessary. Nate moved closer, studying the pod interfaces. The displays showed Verithan biomarkers. He recognized the species from historical databases, though he'd never met one in person. Verithans had been common in this sector before their homeworld's destruction 30 years ago, but the species had scattered and largely disappeared into refugee populations or extinction. These 4 had been in stasis for approximately 14 years, based on pod chronometers. 14 years of minimal metabolic function, waiting in the dark beneath a forgotten moon, hoping someone would find them before sterilization protocols erased every trace of their existence. Nate stood there for a long time, his mind cycling through implications. If he reported this discovery, official channels would take over. The Verithans might be evacuated, or they might spend years in processing limbo while bureaucrats argued about jurisdiction and financial responsibility. The archive around them would probably be seized as valuable cultural assets and disappear into corporate or government databases. If he didn't report them, they'd die in 68 hours when sterilization began. If he woke them without authorization, he'd be violating first contact protocols, exceeding his survey authority, and exposing himself to legal consequences that could end his career. But they'd be alive. Nate looked at the stasis pods, at the 4 sleeping faces visible through transparent panels, looked at the archive surrounding them, 14,000 years of civilization compressed into quantum storage, looked at his own reflection in the pod's polished surface, a 40-year-old surveyor who'd chosen lonely work because connection hurt too much. Then he reached for the pod controls and began emergency revival protocols, watching vital signs strengthen as ancient medical systems coaxed 4 minds back toward consciousness. Because some choices, Nate thought, define who you actually are when protocols and convenience stop mattering. And he'd rather be the person who saved them than the person who followed the rules while they died. The revival process took 6 hours. Nate monitored it with growing anxiety, second-guessing his decision approximately every 12 minutes, but unable to bring himself to abort the sequence. His hands kept reaching for his comm unit to contact the Galactic Resources Collective, request guidance, follow the procedures he'd spent 20 years learning. But he knew what those procedures would produce. He'd seen the bureaucracy process similar discoveries before, watched committees debate whether potentially valuable biological assets were worth evacuation expenses. He'd read reports where survivors spent years in legal limbo while various authorities argued about jurisdiction, responsibility, and cost-benefit ratios. The first pod opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure. The woman inside, tall and slender with bronze skin and ears that tapered to elegant points, sat up slowly, testing whether her body remembered basic motor functions. Her eyes took nearly a minute to focus, pupils adjusting to light after 14 years of darkness. When she saw Nate standing there in his environmental suit, she froze completely. "Please don't be alarmed," Nate said, his suit's translator rendering his words in Galactic common. "My name is Nathaniel Cross. I'm a human surveyor. I found you in stasis. You're safe." The woman stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through confusion and calculation. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse from disuse. "How long?" "Approximately 14 years since stasis initialization, based on your pod readings." Her face did something complicated, grief and resignation and confirmation of fears she'd already accepted. "Then, we are the last. The others chose the peaceful ending." The remaining 3 pods opened in sequence over the next 30 minutes. Each woman woke with similar careful movements, similar questions, similar expressions when they learned how long they'd slept, and that Nate was their only greeting committee. They introduced themselves with formal precision despite their obvious disorientation. Lyra was the first to wake, an astrophysicist who'd specialized in stellar mechanics. Kessa was a geological engineer whose left arm bore cybernetic augmentations that hummed softly as they reactivated. Denna was a cultural archivist whose eyes seemed to shift color in different lighting. Sara was a biosystem specialist who moved with medical precision even while recovering from 14 years of stasis. All Verithan, all professional scholars chosen by their community for reasons Nate was beginning to understand. Our settlement knew the moon would eventually be reclaimed. Lyra explained after they'd spent an hour testing their recovered motor functions and checking the archive systems. When the Verath Consortium collapsed, we were stranded here with no resources for evacuation. We calculated we had between 14 and 20 years before sterilization protocols would be authorized. "You've been waiting for rescue for 14 years?" Nate asked. "Not rescue, discovery." Kessa's cybernetic fingers traced patterns on the archive interface. "We knew no one would come specifically for us. We hoped someone would find us before the purge." Denna activated a holographic display showing population data. "Our settlement contained 200 Verithans when the consortium abandoned this moon. We held a consensus discussion, our traditional decision-making process, about survival options. The options were limited, Sora continued. We couldn't afford evacuation transport. We had no citizenship status that would guarantee asylum elsewhere. We could have dispersed individually, tried to find placement in other settlements, but that would have meant scattering our remaining cultural continuity across the galaxy. So you chose this, Nate said, gesturing at the archive and the four women. 4 survivors in stasis waiting to be found. We chose preservation, Lyra corrected gently. Everything is here. 14,000 years of Verithan culture, compressed into quantum storage. Our history, our science, our art and philosophy and accumulated knowledge. The 4 of us were selected as custodians because we possess the practical expertise to access, interpret, and teach what the archive contains. The other 196, Nate asked though he already knew, chose collective peaceful death. Verithan cultural practice allows communities to decide about survival when resources are insufficient. They gave us this chance through their sacrifice. The weight of it hit Nate like physical pressure. 200 people choosing death so 4 could preserve their civilization's legacy, beautiful and horrible simultaneously. Why not just preserve the archive? He asked. Why risk your lives on the chance someone would find you? Kessa answered, her cybernetic hand gesturing at the surrounding data storage. Because information without context is meaningless. Data can be copied, but cultural understanding requires living transmission. We're not just carrying data. We're carrying the ability to teach what it means, to explain why it matters, to help others understand Verithan perspectives. We're not victims waiting for rescue, Denna added, her color-shifting eyes showing determination. We're professionals making a calculated pitch. We know what we're offering and what we're asking for. Lyra cut to the practical issue. When does sterilization begin? Nate checked his chronometer, 62 hours. I activated the beacon 3 days ago, standard protocol for condemned sites. Once activated, the sequence is automatic. I can't abort it remotely. Can you evacuate us before then? Yes. My ship can carry 4 additional passengers. That's not the problem. What is the problem? Nate explained the legal situation. Taking them without reporting would violate first contact protocols, exceed his survey authority, potentially expose him to charges of unauthorized biological transfer across jurisdictional boundaries. But reporting them would trigger official channels that might evacuate them properly or might trap them in processing bureaucracy for years. We understand the dilemma, Lyra said. You're risking your career to help strangers you have no obligation to. I'm risking paperwork to not let 4 people die when I can prevent it. The 4 Verithans exchanged glances, some silent communication happening in expressions Nate couldn't quite read. Then Kessa spoke. We need to be clear about what we're asking. We're not just requesting evacuation. We're asking you to take responsibility for preserving our species' cultural legacy, for giving us time to establish ourselves and find ways to share what we've protected. That's considerably more than just giving you a ride. Yes, Denna agreed, which is why we're offering you the choice to refuse. Verithan culture values informed consent. We won't manipulate you or make emotional appeals beyond presenting the situation honestly. You can walk away, report finding us through official channels, and we'll accept whatever bureaucracy produces. Nate looked at the 4 of them, scholars who'd sacrificed everything on the slim chance of preservation, professionals treating him as an equal partner in decision-making rather than a savior or obligation. Then he looked at the archive humming around them, 14,000 years waiting to die in 61 hours unless someone chose otherwise. I need time to think, he said. A few hours to assess the practical situation, understand the actual risks we're facing. That's reasonable, Lyra said. We've waited 14 years. A few more hours won't make a difference. Nate returned to the Meridian's edge, sat in his pilot's seat surrounded by familiar systems, and stared at the protocols displayed on his console. Official channels, proper procedures, the safe choices that kept you clear of consequences. And 4 women sleeping beneath a condemned moon, chosen by their community to carry forward everything that mattered, trusting a stranger to decide whether they lived or died. Some choices, Nate thought, define you more than a career ever could. He began planning evacuation logistics, calculating cargo capacity and life support requirements, mapping routes to settlements where refugees might find sanctuary. Because he'd already decided. He decided the moment he opened those stasis pods. Now he just needed to figure out how to make it work. Nate spent 6 hours analyzing options with the methodical thoroughness that had made him a competent surveyor if not an inspired one. He reviewed salvage laws, refugee protocols, first contact regulations, and corporate policies about biological material transfer. The legal landscape was a maze of contradictions where he could find precedent for almost any interpretation he wanted. What became clear was that no choice was clean. Reporting the Verathans would trigger official evacuation, but they'd likely be separated from their archive and processed through systems that didn't recognize their cultural authority. Not reporting them meant violating regulations, but preserving their agency over how and when to share their knowledge. His cargo calculations were more straightforward. The Meridian's Edge could support 4 additional passengers for approximately 3 weeks with current supplies, longer with rationing. His next scheduled check-in with the collective wasn't for another month. He could buy time. A message arrived on his personal comm from Marcus Webb, an old colleague now working with the Archon Foundation. The timing felt suspiciously convenient. Heard you're surveying Kepler C. If you find anything regarding Verathan settlement records, the Foundation would be interested in consulting. We have resources for cultural preservation. Nate stared at the message. Either Marcus had contacts who flagged sites associated with endangered species, or the universe had a sense of timing. Either way, it represented an option he hadn't considered. People who actually cared about cultural preservation, who might have legal frameworks to help. He returned to the archive facility, where the 4 women had begun systematically access to the archive eventually, on terms you negotiate. Their mission is cultural preservation and education, but they respect source communities' authority over their heritage. The Verathans conferred in their musical language, a conversation that took several minutes. Finally, Lyra turned back. We'll trust your guidance on how to proceed, with the understanding that we retain authority over the archive. Agreed, but you need to understand what you're facing. Nate hesitated. As far as galactic records are concerned, your species is functionally extinct. You're not refugees in the traditional sense. You're cultural custodians carrying knowledge from a dead civilization. That makes you valuable and vulnerable. You're warning us that our archive makes us targets, Denna observed. I'm warning you that information attracts predators, corporate interests, academic institutions, even well-meaning organizations. Everyone will want access to what you've preserved. You need to be strategic about trust, including trust in you, Lyra said. Especially trust in me. I'm not a hero. I'm a burned-out surveyor who volunteered for lonely work. I just happened to be here when you needed someone. Kessa laughed, a sound like wind chimes. You described that as disqualification. We chose to trust you precisely because you're honest about limitations. Heroes believe in their righteousness. Practical people admit their uncertainties. They spent the rest of the day preparing evacuation. The archive's quantum storage compressed into crystalline matrices small enough to carry. The women packed essential items, research materials, cultural artifacts, clothing adapted for different atmospheres. Everything else stayed behind. Feels wrong, Denna said, looking around the facility. Leaving this place after what everyone sacrificed to create it. We're not leaving it, Lyra corrected. We're taking what matters. The place was always temporary. Loading the Meridian's Edge took 4 hours. Nate converted a storage bay into temporary quarters, rigging environmental controls from ship supplies. The women adapted with the flexibility of people accustomed to making do, immediately optimizing systems and finding inefficiencies Nate had lived with for years. As departure approached, Nate ran final checks on the sterilization beacon. In 58 hours, Kepler-279c would be scoured clean, all evidence of Verithan presence erased. Any regrets? He asked Lyra as they watched the moon through viewports. About surviving when others didn't, always. But regret doesn't change responsibility. She paused. What about you? I violated protocols the moment I opened those pods. Everything since has just been committing to consequences. Nate initiated launch sequence. Ask me in a month if I regret it. The Meridian's edge lifted from Kepler-279c, leaving ruins that would soon be memories. Nate plotted course for Haven's Reach, a frontier station 3 weeks away where the Archon Foundation maintained presence. That evening, they gathered in the improvised common area, cargo containers rearranged into something resembling social space. Nate shared surveyors' rations, apologizing for bland nutrition. The Verithans shared stories about their previous lives, about the community that chose sacrifice for preservation, about what they hoped to achieve. And Nate realized he didn't feel lonely anymore. Burdened by responsibility, yes. Uncertain about the future, absolutely. But not alone. Because sitting across from him were 4 people who'd chosen to trust him with everything that mattered to them. And somehow that made him feel like maybe his life could still leave a mark after all. 3 weeks in close quarters transformed the Meridian's edge from a vessel designed for solitary operation into something that almost felt like home. Nate discovered that spaces built for one person's isolation could actually accommodate connection if you were willing to adapt. Mornings became maintenance and education. Nate teaching the Verithans his systems while Kessa identified improvements and Lyra absorbed specifications with astrophysicist precision. Afternoons were cultural exchange. The women sharing their archive, teaching Nate about Verithan history, philosophy, scientific contributions that had shaped early galactic development. He learned that Verithan culture emphasized collective decision-making, which explained their approach to survival. Learned about their mathematical contributions to FTL theory, their philosophical frameworks for understanding consciousness, their artistic traditions combining visual and auditory elements in ways human perception barely grasped. Denna documented everything, recording Nate's reactions as part of the archive's expansion. You're the first non-Verithan to receive intentional cultural transmission in 14 years. Your perspective helps us understand how to teach our knowledge to others. Evenings became social time. Shared meals, Verithan dietary requirements compatible with human food synthesizers, though they found Earth cuisine aggressively flavored. Stories exchanged. The Verithans shared legends from their lost homeworld. Nate shared Earth's fumbling path to the stars. Your people are fascinatingly contradictory, Sara observed one evening. You celebrate individualism while forming intense social bonds. You claim rationality while making deeply emotional decisions. You build systems and then break them when they conflict with personal values. That's one way to describe humans, Nate agreed. Inconsistent, stubborn, and weirdly principled at inconvenient times. It's why you saved us, Lyra said. A purely rational actor would have followed protocols. An emotional actor might have saved us impulsively, but regretted it. You calculated consequences and chose to accept them because you decided that's who you wanted to be. Around the second week, complications emerged. The collective sent routine communication requesting status updates. Nate had to file reports. He consulted the Verithans, explaining the situation. They gathered for what Lyra called consensus discussion, their traditional decision-making process. If you report us, what happens? Kessa asked. Nate outlined scenarios. Official protocols would claim jurisdiction. The Verithans would be transported to processing facilities. The archive would be seized pending legal resolution. Worst case, you're separated from the archive and spend years fighting to regain control. Best case, you're recognized as cultural custodians but subject to extensive restrictions. What if you don't report us? Dena asked. I file standard reports claiming the site was abandoned as expected. Kepler 279c gets sterilized on schedule. We continue to Haven's Reach, contact the Foundation, and try to establish your status independently. The risks of that approach, Sora pressed. If caught before establishing legitimate cover, I'm charged with violations and you're treated as contraband. Both of us end up worse off. The Verathans conferred for an hour, building consensus rather than voting. Finally, Lyra spoke. We trust your judgment. You understand these systems better than we do. If you believe the risk is acceptable, we accept your assessment. That's a lot of faith in a stranger. You stopped being a stranger when you spent 2 weeks teaching Kessa environmental systems, while Dena recorded your terrible jokes. Lyra's expression showed warmth. You've proven trustworthy through sustained behavior, not grand gestures. Nate filed standard reports. Kepler 279c abandoned as expected, no anomalies, sterilization proceeding normally. The lies sat uncomfortably, but he committed to them. 3 days before Haven's Reach, Marcus Webb responded. The Foundation was very interested in meeting potential Verathan custodians. They had legal resources, could provide sanctuary, had experience navigating preservation bureaucracy. But Marcus included warning. Verathan archives are rumored to contain valuable scientific data. Corporate interests have searched for surviving knowledge for years. If word gets out, you'll attract attention you don't want. The Verathans weren't surprised. We knew our knowledge was valuable, Lyra said. That's why we preserved ourselves as living custodians. We maintain control over dissemination. But it makes you targets, Nate pointed out. Everything makes someone a target if they have what others want. At least this way, we have agency. Haven's Reach appeared on schedule. A frontier station built into an asteroid, home to 50,000 beings from dozens of species. The kind of place where questions weren't asked carefully, where the Archon Foundation maintained presence because endangered cultures often found sanctuary here. Nate docked, filed arrival documentation, sent encrypted message to Marcus's contact. Response came within an hour. Marcus wanted to meet privately before official introductions. They gathered in a rented conference room. Marcus arrived alone, a weathered human in his 60s who'd spent decades working for causes that didn't pay well. He looked at the 4 Verathan women with profound relief. You're real. I'd started to think Verathan preservation was a myth. We're what's left, Lyra said. 4 custodians in an archive, not much but something. Marcus listened to their story, the community's choice, 14 years in stasis, Nate finding them days before sterilization. His expression cycled through horror, admiration, determination. The Foundation can help. We have legal frameworks for exactly this. We can establish you as recognized custodians, provide sanctuary, offer resources for preservation and education. What do you want? Kessa asked bluntly. Access for educational purposes, with you controlling terms. The Foundation's mission is preventing cultural extinction. We want Verathan knowledge to survive and be shared appropriately, but source communities should maintain authority. They spent 6 hours negotiating. The Verathans proved skilled, not aggressive, but extremely thorough. Marcus matched their precision, demonstrating Foundation experience. By evening, they had preliminary agreement. Foundation sponsorship for refugee status, legal representation, sanctuary at preservation facilities, resources for archive maintenance and education. In return, non-exclusive access for research and education, with Verathans retaining full authority over what gets shared and how. What about Nate? Sora asked. He violated regulations to save us. What protections does he get? Marcus appraised Nate. Technically, you violated multiple protocols. If the collective wanted to make an example, they could. But, but if you're working as cultural preservation consultant for the Foundation, those actions become defensible as emergency salvage under Helios Accords. We'd formalize employment retroactively, create paper trails supporting your version. You're offering me a job. I'm offering legal cover that comes with a job. Whether you actually want to work in preservation is up to you, but we could use someone with your experience and your willingness to prioritize people over protocols. Nate looked at the four women who transformed his ship and his life, looked at Marcus offering him a path more meaningful than processing abandoned sites, thought about what kind of person he wanted to be when choices mattered. I'm in. On one condition, I want to stay involved helping the Verathans establish themselves. I didn't save them just to hand them off. Lyra showed what might be amusement. You're taking responsibility for us. We're adults. We can manage our affairs. I know, but you trusted me when you had no reason to. I want to honor that by following through. The women exchanged glances. Then Kessa spoke. We accept your continued involvement. Having an advocate who understands both our situation and galactic bureaucracy will be valuable. Marcus finalized arrangements. The Foundation would transport the Verathans to Threshold Station, their primary preservation facility. Nate would accompany them as official liaison and consultant. The Meridian's Edge would be registered as Foundation property. The story concludes with 5 of them on a Foundation transport, watching Haven's reach recede as they head toward Threshold Station. Nate reflects on how his life changed in less than a month, from isolated surveyor to someone responsible for preserving 14,000 years of culture. Thank you, Lyra says quietly beside him at the viewport, for choosing us, for risking everything on the chance that we mattered. You always mattered. The galaxy just needed someone to actually look. Denna joins them, her color-shifting eyes reflecting starlight. You know what this makes you in Verathan culture, our preservation guardian, the one who ensured continuation when extinction seemed certain. One of our highest honors. I just did what anyone should have done. But you're the one who actually did it, Sora points out. That's the difference between theoretical ethics and practical morality. Kessa completes the circle, cybernetic arm whirring. Our community chose us to carry Verathan